The conversation thus far has largely been about how to get a representative sample to be able to say something credible about the world. And that's largely grounded in a statistical or a quantitative worldview of what it means to be able to say something authoritative about the larger world. But some social scientists come at that problem in a different way, and they use more qualitative methods. And we'll be talking about some of those methods today, starting with the conversation on interviewing. So when we think about sampling, what we're trying to do is we're trying to draw a representative sample that looks like, that represents the broader target population. And the thinking is that if we have that if we've done a random sample drawn from a population, we should be able to generalize our findings to that population. But with interviewing and other qualitative methods, the goal is less about trying to get a representative sample or even a representative picture of what's happening in the world. Rather, we go about our sampling in a very intentional way. We could call it purposive sampling, right? Where I'm selecting cases not because I'm trying to take advantage of sort of the nature of randomness and how it tends to give us accurate results over time on average, but instead I'm using the fact that there's a specific person, could call him a key informant maybe, who has specific knowledge of a topic that they've derived from their own experiences or from their background or their study, or they're in that position where they have that kind of knowledge and that kind of access. And I'm seeking out that specific person because I want their knowledge and I want their perspective. And random sampling would be a bizarre way to go about getting that. If I was interested in city managers and how city managers have responded to COVID, calling up people at random and asking them, are you a city manager, is not a reasonable way to go about doing that. It would make much more sense to sit down and chat with 30 city managers. But again, that's not necessarily a random sample. And do I necessarily know if that 30 reflects the larger pattern of city managers? Another sort of criteria that we use for evaluating purposive sampling and interviewing and qualitative research in general is the idea that our samples are authentic, or that our data and our collection process is authentic. And what that means is that we've captured the full range of perspectives that are out there, right? We haven't excluded particular voices or particular views, that we've kind of got our hands around the whole of the problem or the topic. And that's the goal of qualitative sampling rather than representative sampling in the statistical sense. Okay, so if you're going to do interviews, and to try to kind of tease out some of this more qualitative information, there's sort of a range of ways that you can set these things up. And so we'll just kind of talk through some of the different ways that people do. So we'll start with structure, because structure are the sort of rigid, they're the questionnaires that you might see there. When people do public opinion surveys, that's what they're working with. There's a set list of questions. They are administered the same way each time. Every participant gets the same sort of survey experience. That's a structured interview process, right? You're coming to the table with specific questions that you need to get answered, and you're oftentimes only allowing people to respond to you in specific ways, right? Pick from these 5 categories. Semi-structured interviews don't necessarily and oftentimes don't have a set questionnaire. Instead, what they have is a series of questions that the researcher brings to the table with him or her, right? And the idea with this is that the researcher has a pretty good sense of things that need to get answered. But they also recognize that maybe they don't know all of the questions to ask. And so part of that interview process is allowing space for things to sort of go off the rails, right? So we start having this conversation about this question I asked, and the person I'm interviewing sort of veers off in another direction. I think, whoa, that's really interesting. I didn't know that particular sort of angle on this problem. I don't want to steer that person back and be like, I'm sorry, we got to get through this questionnaire. I want to let them go with that and explore that topic and share with me what they're seeing as the connections. So you start with questions that you want to tackle, but you allow for space to run. Unstructured interviews are maybe where you go in and just kind of set the stage for the participant. You sort of give them a background on kind of what you're interested in understanding and curious about, and where the project is coming from or why you're conducting this interview. And then you just kind of let them run with it and let them go where they think you need to to go to understand that topic. And so you're allowing the participant or the interviewee to really drive that conversation forward. And your job as the facilitator is just to kind of keep them going, keep them working through some of their thoughts and perspectives. And then we can talk about informal interviewing, which is just, spontaneous talking to people. I'm on the bus and I start chatting with somebody, and it turns out that anecdote is completely relevant to a thing that I'm studying, and that's an interview, and that's data. I can use that. I can bring that into my understanding, my analysis. So interviewing covers sort of this wide spectrum of different kind of activities, and I think it's worth knowing that spectrum ahead of time so you can think purposefully about which of these strategies you decide that you want to employ to get the kind of results that you want to get. Okay, so lastly, in this sort of really brief intro to interviewing, I want to talk about where you go to get people to interview, how you find folks, and how you find folks who represent a broad range of perspectives. And so one of those approaches is just cold calls, right? You just pick up the phone and you call somebody up and say, hey, would you be willing to interview on this topic? And I, would appreciate an hour of your time. That can be great in that you can recognize I need to get people with this background. So if I'm interested in city managers responding to COVID, and I've got a bunch of city managers from medium to large cities, and I recognize that I don't have a lot of folks from rural areas, I can go online, look up city manager for some rural towns and give that person a call and say, hey, would you participate in my surveys, right? So I'm calling people I don't know because I'm able to get at, because I'm interested in sort of the different perspective they might bring to the table. But that person doesn't know me. That person doesn't know why they would want to give their time to me. They don't know that they can even trust me necessarily. Working at a university, I found that it oftentimes helps to sort of preface a cold call by sending out a letter in advance. And so when I interviewed city managers a number of years back, the first thing I did was type up a letter explaining the study and mailing it out to them and using the university letterhead, right? Because that would be a way of sort of signaling I have credibility. I'm coming from a, reputable place. I'm not doing, this sort of this crazy off the cuff sort of thing that you might not know about, or might be sort of a gotcha kind of thing. That this is actual legitimate conversation I'm hoping to have. And then when I make the phone call, they've already had some time to think about, would they participate? It's not catching them by surprise. They can, have time to go and look me up on the web and figure out who I am and if I'm legitimate. And so that cold call tends to go a little bit better because I've had that sort of letter ahead of time to kind of warm things up. In fact, I might even call that a warm call rather than a cold call. I've sort of got things started already. Referrals are fantastic. Referrals allow for you to make that phone call and say, I'm calling you because so-and-so thought you would be a great person to talk to. And now I'm piggybacking on whatever relationship that person has with so-and-so, because that relationship is going to be sort of my gateway in. It's going to be open the door for me. And sometimes that you need those gatekeepers or those people who can provide you with access to folks who might not talk to just somebody out of the blue. So referrals can be really valuable. The problem with referrals is that if we rely solely on referrals, we're sort of stuck within social networks, and we might not be actually getting an authentic view of a topic or a problem or the world, because we're sort of trapped within those social networks. And we talked about that with snowball sampling, how you kind of have to push people to reach the edge of their networks, those chance encounters. And while that can help you break out of those networks, it also means that the value of that referral, this person that you met twice gave me your name, doesn't necessarily provide the same social connection and trust building, credibility building kind of boost that somebody who's closer friends with the person being referred could provide. And then lastly, we could talk about chance encounters. you never know where you're going to find interesting and useful conversations with people. And sometimes we just randomly bump into people who can give us useful insights. Um, I've read studies. I think there was a article a number of years back I read about a guy who's trying to get access to the leadership of the Catholic Church in Argentina, and kept trying to get a meeting with the bishop and just kept getting blocked in that meeting by the underlings, and was just feeling really dejected until was riding on the bus one day and started up a conversation with an older gentleman who turned out to be the bishop, and was able to get this whole conversation that he'd been trying for months to set up taken care of through one of these chance encounters. And that's fantastic, and it makes for a great story. I just wouldn't build your entire research plan on I'm going to show up and ride the bus and hope I bump into the people I want to bump into.